I'm Dane Rose. One of the most interesting things I discovered when doing an Amazon search is there's only one book in the entire world that comes up as a response for a search on cultural design. And if you think of the root word beneath culture, it's cult. What is a cult? A cult is a group of people that do what they do because, right, wait for it, because that's what they do. And they all copy one another because, wait for it, that's the norm. That's what's normal. A cult is a group of people that all copy each other. And if you ask them, why do you always do this? The answer is because. Because what? Because that's the most scientific way to do it, because that's the way the other culture does it? No, because that's the way it's done. And why is it the way it's done? Well, it's done that way. It's the way it's done because it's done that way. And why? Why is it done that way? Why not this other way? There's this wonderful story about fiance marrying this woman, and he notices that she always cuts the front and back of the ham off, right? She bakes this traditional Christmas ham, and she always cuts the ends off of both sides. And why? Why are you doing that? She says, well, because my mother did it. Right? And he meets the mother, and my grandmother did it. And then one day they're having dinner at the grandmother's, and he's been puzzling this whole time because he's never seen anyone do this before. And he asks her, Grandma, why do you cut the ends off of the ham for the traditional meal? And she says, because my baking dish was too small. Growing up, we didn't, that was the only dish I had to put in the oven, and the ham was a bit too big, so I cut off both ends. And then her daughter copied it, even though the dish was bigger, and her daughter copied it. And that's what a cult is. That's what a culture is. Like, why do we cut a green fir tree? Why not a green magnolia tree for Christmas? Well, it's not the way that it's done, right? So the definition of a cult is a group of people that hold on for dear life to a particular way of doing things. And they all do the exact same thing. And of course, there's always a leader, right? Every cult has its leaders, its mythologies, its origin story. And then everyone else does that same thing. And the most striking thing to me about a cult is that there's no room for thinking. And so it makes sense that no one has ever written a book on how to design a more effective cult or a more effective culture. Because design and cult thinking are the antithesis of one another. So it makes sense. Now, it was the only book, so it was an easy choice. I bought it, and it was not a book for designing a culture, but rather philosophy about ecology, and it touched around the peripheral edges. But here's the stunning fact about this story. And to me, it's absolutely mind-boggling. 90% of everything you do, everything I do, everything that the human species does, will do, and has done is directly influenced by culture. Language, meaning there are billions of sounds that we could attach to different objects, and billions of ways of communicating meaning relating to those objects. We are using one billionth of the possibility field with our language. And as anthropologists have correctly pointed out, 95% of the 10,000 cultures, each with their own language, are now extinct. 95% of every cult that has ever existed, with its language, its belief system, its diet, its worldview, its mythology, this is the right way to do things, is dead. Now, if you think about that, because it's something that cults don't think about, cults always reference themselves. We do this because we do this, and that's the way it is. And that's the way it is because that's the way it was. And so, right, ta-da, that's why we do it. Right. Notice there wasn't a single bit of science in the entire narrative. We do it because we do it. And that's the way it is. Now, if you ever had a conversation with your parents growing up, you also knew that you got punished, right, for trying to do things differently. I don't want to go to school. Why? Because, well, it's boring, and they're not teaching very interesting subjects. I mean, they're not teaching me how to drive a car. They don't teach me how to build a house. They don't teach me how to get married. They don't teach me how to have a great sex life. They don't teach me anything. I already know basic mathematics. It's like, what am I doing here? Well, that's the way it's done. And then once you've finished here and high school and stuff, then you're going to go to college. But so many people, but that's the way it's done. And we don't question the thoughts of the cult. And that's why it's so eye-opening to understand that 95% of all the cults in human history are extinct. Meaning that all those parents that told all of their children to do it this way, we eat monkeys, we hunt them with a blowpipe, this is what we do. This is the way it's done. This is what we speak. This is the name of the God. This is that. That's the way it is. You're 13 years old. You're going to get married. You're the chieftain's daughter, so you have to get married to the strongest man. That's the way it's done. 95% of all of these stories are dead. All of them. Extinct. Not a single cult member remains to tell the story. Now that's in the last 30,000 years. So what does that mean for the next 10 to 30,000 years? Right? Because every religion, and every religion is part of it, part of its cult. Every cult has its own religion or set of religions. Every religion, like a cult, says the same thing. This is the only way. This is the way. Our God is the best God. And this is what our God says to do. This is the name of the God. This is the best one. This is the way. Because there is not a single point in history, a single culture of all those 9,500 cults that are dead, where the people said, you know, this is not the best diet. There's going to come a time when pizza comes along and it's way better than all of this. It's not the best diet. And this language, you know, it's a bit clumsy. Yes, it does identify rock, boulder, you know, ham, but it's a bit of a crude language. It's going to die out. There's a better language coming. And our religion, you know, the world is made by a giant turtle. The turtle does this. Yeah, that's going to go by the wayside as well. And whether you throw the biggest spear and the longest hoopla or whatever it is, that's no longer going to be relevant. And so just forget about all this, because our cult will be extinct soon. There's never been a single cult member that said, you know, they're doing it way better over there. So don't do it our way, go do it that way. That's what the science suggests. Every cult member always says, this is the way it is because this is the way it is. But if you ask, well, is that the best way? They all say that their way is the best way. It can't be, of course. Now, cultures and cults serve a tremendously valuable function. Number one, they protect us from chaos. If everyone speaks their own language, if everyone drives whichever way they drive, if everyone, some people work 1 hour a day, the other people work 12 hours a day, another one works 5 hours. A cult protects us from chaos. It brings order. A cult helps us know what to expect. It protects us from the unknown. If everyone's doing their own thing, we don't know what they're going to say, what they're going to do. Right? What about those tribes where if you wanted to marry a girl, you had to get your buddies and you had to capture her successfully from her parents? Right? So you sneaked out, waited. She was out in the garden, and then you ran in, you got her, you rushed off, and then you could have sex with her, and then you were married. Right? But that's the way it's done. Well, you can't have that just made up by an individual, right? And then someone else says that's rape, and you go to prison for 30 years, but another one says, no, that's a legitimate marriage. He caught her fair and square. What are you talking about? Right? So you can't just, we've got to protect ourselves from the unknown. And that means everyone's got to do it the same way. We can't have individuals, right? The Life of Brian. You must all be individuals. Yes, we will all be individuals. What else do we need to do? Right? If you actually have individuals, people with their own ideas, their own thoughts, etc., well, what will they do? Right? So cultures protect us from the unknown. They also give us a rest from thinking. Right? If you always drive on the right side of the road, then you don't have to think about it. You just drive on the right side of the road, and you don't have to think about other people. They're going to drive on the right side of the road as well. So cultures establish what's called the default mode network in the brain. Cultures are the default mode network of a body of people. And so this is an incredibly valuable function, because if every moment of every day you have to think about everything, the conscious mind simply can't keep up with it. And so what happens is that 90% of all human action is just relegated to the default. We drive on this side of the road, we drive the speed limit, we use these cars, people walk here, not in the middle of the road. Animals are on leashes. People use defecate in toilets. They're stationed here. You say hello. You say hello. We speak this language. We all agree we're going to do the same thing. Now, what this means is that 90% of all behavior on Earth is originating out of the well of culture, out of the well of cult thinking, for the amazing reason that it's normal, meaning it's a norm, meaning it's a default. We do it without thinking, by default. Now, if I was to say to you that 8 billion people are going to spend 90% of their money, 90% of their time, 90% of their choices are all going to be done by default, because that's the way it's done. That's just the way it's done. And that's it. If you wanted to have a major impact on the world, if you wanted to say, well, people are depressed, people are unhappy, people are lonely, people are scared, let's change that. Well, you have two areas to look, right? So you have the 10% of human behavior and initiative that is organized by rational thought, by individuality, by initiative. I think I'll do this today. And then you have 90% of all behavior falling into the default mode network of each individual's brain, which is a download of cult thinking. Which would you want to change to get the biggest result? Another way of saying it is, if someone has $1 million and you want to effect change, and you can pick how they spend $100,000, or you can pick how they spend $900,000. Which would you pick? The $100,000 chunk or the $900,000 chunk? Right? Which is having the most impact? The culture or the rational freedoms of the individuals within that culture? And anyone looking at this scientifically, and I realize this is a breach of cult etiquette, anyone looking at this scientifically would say, if you want to dramatically change the outcomes in a positive direction for a group of people, the obvious place to pay attention is to the controls that dictate 90% of what every person in that culture does. That's where the real power is. That's where the real freedom is. That's the single most potent form of possible agency for any group of people at any point in history, anywhere in the world. Like, just imagine for a moment that you could turn a switch and the default mode network of a particular culture was that deleting sugar from the entire ecology was a mark of strength. And that one of the things to measure about an individual is, can they give up the soporific, expedient pleasure and become mature enough to seek food that was whole, that was bitter, that was not filled with refined sugar? Well, if that was actually a metric by which people measured and were taught about this, then 90% of all people, 90% of the time, become influenced. They move in that direction of reducing sugar, of increasing whole foods. And for anyone studying health and medicine at a deep level, you understand immediately the reduction in inflammation, the reduction in diabetes, the reduction in obesity. It's a completely different population by just changing that default from salt and sweet to bitter and sour as being the default, as being the goal, right? And then if you start bringing in things like, to be a real man, you drink something really bitter, right? And suddenly you have, liver cancers disappear, etc. That's just one variable in the cult code. And you can see that you can change the outcomes. How likely is nuclear war? How likely is divorce? How likely is loneliness? How likely is depression? How likely is cancer? How likely is diabetes? How likely is obesity? All of these statistics are directly influenced by the cult code. And this is, of course, the paradox. All the power, all the true influence is in the domain of the cult code. And while there is a fair amount of cultural criticism, there is no science, as reflected in the fact that there are no books on cultural design, which is the same as saying that all of the books that you read in self-help and self-esteem and health and all that, they're all targeting the 10% of human behavior that is conscious and done with agency. The 90% of, I never thought of it. I've spoken with dozens of women in the context of romantic relationships. And I ask every woman the same question. I said, what does someone need to do to facilitate for you the experience of being completely, totally, and utterly loved? What does someone need to do to you? How does someone need to treat you and not to treat you? How does someone show up for you such that you feel totally, completely, and utterly loved? what's your answer to this question? Well, I can tell you the answer of every single human that I've asked this question of, mostly women. Nobody has ever asked me that before. I do not know the answer. I've never thought about it. And you look at this as an objective scientist and you say, you're coming to me to have a loving relationship. Meaning that's a relay of energy and form, and you want the outcome to be love. You want an exchange of loving energy. Yes, I do. And no one in your entire cult, including you, has ever asked the question what that would look like in any detail. Yeah, that's it. And if you don't grasp how insane that is, it's like saying, I'd like to have a solar power plant. Okay, we're getting together to generate solar power. Okay. So, where is it? Where's the solar power? All right, so what would have to happen here for solar power to be generated? No idea. Nobody's ever asked that. But you're here to generate solar power. Yes, that's why we're here. And whose fault is it that no power is being generated? Well, it's my partner. They're supposed to guess, right? I mean, it's the rest of the group. They're not doing it. How do they do it? No idea. Nobody's ever asked. You know, this is mind-numbingly absurd. But if you're part of a cult that is mind-numbingly absurd, it's, well, you don't look around and say that's absurd and change it, because that's individual initiative. You look around and say, well, nobody else is asking that question. Everyone else is upset with their relationships. Nobody else feels completely and totally loved. It's not what's done here. And so you'd give up the chance to feel completely, utterly, and totally loved. Meaning you have no chance of that because you don't even know what it looks like. You're not even thinking about it. You'd give that totally for the rest of your life just to fit into your cult. When I talk to women, I've always spent most of my time with older people. So when I talk with women 50 and 60 and 70 years old, and I never thought about this, and nobody ever asked me that. And no, I've never experienced that. I don't know how to do that. And I realize that's all the important stuff. Peak experiences, sustain. That's the important stuff. And nobody is even on the right track. No one's even practicing that skill. Right? That's when the light bulb goes off. The power is not in going through life asleep in a psychologically, traumatically illiterate cult where we don't ask and we don't tell everything that matters, where we don't teach each other everything that matters. That is not a life worth living. And that is the life that 90% of people are living 90% of the time. Not because they're bad, not because it's personal. It isn't. Cults aren't personal. But simply because that's the cult they've been born into. And that cult does not have a bit of code. It doesn't have a line of code that asks that particular question as a default. And so nobody asks it because nobody deviates from the norm. Now, I've asked couples across America a series of 3 or 4 questions that happen to be the single most important questions to intimacy, to love, to marriage. And I've never met a couple that has talked about these questions. And so when I ask the wife, and she tells me or tries to, and then I ask the husband, I say, did you know that? No, I didn't know that. Why not? It didn't come up. Why not? Because it's not the norm. In other words, norms are the single most potent technology that nobody is designing. There's no books on it. There's no university courses. No one is designing the most potent technology on Earth. The technology that determines 90% of all human action. And action is the technology that determines 90% of our ecology and our personal and collective well-being. In other words, no one's at the wheel of 90% of all human action. It just goes to default. This makes cultural design, the design of norms, the default for how you are born and how you die, the default for how you eat, the default for how you communicate, the default for how you open your heart, the default of what you talk about, the default of how you prioritize your life. This makes the default the single most powerful and underutilized technology on Earth. And because there is nothing more powerful that affects more people across time, including the entire ecology of our planet, my greatest interest is on the art of cultural design.